What life's about, without a doubt, is breathing in and breathing out. We breathe a substance we cannot see. We don't have to pay for it, it's totally free. Oxygen, we need oxygen. Oxygen, we breathe oxygen. It's the gas for me.
Turns a spark into a flame. Combustion is the name of its game. Inside us it burns calories. Without that gas we'd simply freeze. Climbing up through the mountain snow. The air gets thinner, the higher you go. Your heart beats faster, your brain turns to stew. Your lungs start screaming, give me more O2.
Oxygen, we need oxygen.
What a blast.
Oxygen, we breathe oxygen.
Fan my flame.
It's not like the food that's on a shelf. We can't make a store inside ourselves. We need it each moment to blow our licks. Oh, oxygen, it's the hippest of kicks. Oxygen, we need oxygen.
O-X-Y-G-E-N.
Oxygen, we breathe oxygen. What a gas! Oxygen, we need oxygen.
Climbing a mountain is a breathtaking experience, in more ways than one. The higher you climb, the thinner the air, and the less oxygen there is to breathe. A mountain is a kind of natural lab to study what happens when the body is deprived of oxygen. If you climb high enough, you may need to bring along your own supply of oxygen. Almost all of the oxygen that sustains us is found within an 11-kilometer thick layer of gas that surrounds the Earth, the atmosphere. Compared to the size of the planet, it's even thinner than an eggshell is to an egg. Of the countless molecules that make up the atmosphere, about 1/5 are oxygen. About 4/5 are nitrogen, and less than 1% consist of argon, carbon dioxide, and other trace gases, natural and man-made. The atmosphere also acts as the Earth's insulation. It filters out some of the sun's ultraviolet rays, especially the dangerous kind that cause skin cancer. Those rays that do get through are absorbed by the Earth, which emits heat back as infrared radiation. The atmosphere acts like a greenhouse and traps these rays along with their heat. Although we can't see the oxygen and other gases that make up the atmosphere, they do have substance and weight. We can feel this best when the air around us begins to move and generate the force of wind. The weight of the air is called the atmospheric pressure. The story of the discovery of oxygen began over 300 years ago with a very visible demonstration that the invisible air around us does have weight. It happened in 1657 in the German town of Magdeburg. The town mayor, Otto van Guericke, invented the first vacuum pump, with which he was able to do a hair-raising experiment. In front of a large crowd that included the Emperor, Ferdinand III, he put together 2 tightly fitted copper hemispheres. He then used his new vacuum pump to suck the air out of this rigid sphere. A team of horses was hitched to each hemisphere and whipped into action. Even with all that horsepower trying to pull it apart, the sphere held together because of the weight of the air pressing upon the vacuum inside. The atmospheric pressure had been discovered.
What's with this Magdeburg sphere?
The Magdeburg experiment can be reproduced using a pair of common household tools. Watch what happens when the vacuum is broken. The pressure inside the sphere equals the pressure outside, and there's nothing to hold it together anymore.
Check out that vacuum in here, man.
Oh. It's stuck, it's stuck. There's definitely a vacuum there.
Guericke's vacuum pump opened the door to other discoveries about air. A few years later, the pioneering English scientist Robert Boyle built vacuum chambers into which he put burning candles and small animals. Boyle and his colleague Robert Hooke discovered that without air, a candle would not burn, and a mouse would soon die. It had now been shown that air was essential both to combustion and to life itself. The next step was taken by another English scientist of the same productive period in the late 17th century, John Mayow. He floated a burning candle on water, then sealed it from the outside air with a bell jar. As the candle burned, the water level in the bell jar rose, showing that something in the air inside it had disappeared. Mayow then put a mouse in a bell jar and sealed the opening with a stretchable membrane. He noticed that after a while the membrane started to bulge into the jar as if a vacuum was forming inside. Again, something in the air was apparently being used up. He called it nitroaerial spirit, but of course it was oxygen. A century later, again in England, Joseph Priestley actually produced oxygen by heating mercuric oxide. At the same time, and working independently, a Swedish pharmacist, Carl Wilhelm Scheele, made oxygen from saltpeter or potassium nitrate. However, neither Priestley nor Scheele realized the importance of the gas they had discovered. That was left to the great French chemist Antoine Lavoisier. He quickly realized that oxygen was the breath of life itself. He too claimed the discovery of oxygen, but picked the wrong side during the French Revolution and soon lost his head to the guillotine. Since Lavoisier's time, the way oxygen is manufactured has changed considerably. At this oxygen plant, a computer controls a system of pipes which compress and cool air into a liquid form, then distill it into its component liquid parts. Like other gases, oxygen shrinks when cooled. It enters the liquid phase at its boiling point of minus 179 degrees centigrade. Oxygen is easier to store and transport in liquid form. From here, it is shipped to hospitals, steel mills, and chemical factories, where it will be evaporated back into a gas. Whether in liquid or gas form, oxygen atoms are very reactive. They have 6 electrons in their outermost shell, 2 short of the ring of 8 needed for stability.
Hey man, can you spare 2 electrons?
I'm a couple short myself.
By combining 2 pairs of electrons, 2 oxygen atoms can form a stable molecule with complete outer shells.
8 feels great.
This kind of chemical union, held together by shared electrons, is called a covalent bond. It can also take place between an oxygen molecule and another atom, for instance, carbon, which has 4 electrons in its outer orbit.
Hey, check this out.
Let's split, man.
You bond with those 2, and I'll hook onto these 2.
The carbon and oxygen combine electrons to form a new substance, carbon dioxide. During this transformation of carbon into its oxide, carbon is said to be oxidized, and oxygen is said to be reduced. This kind of oxidation reaction usually produces heat. If the oxidation is rapid enough, the substance being oxidized begins to burn. Combustion is oxidation in its most rapid form. Most fuels are hydrocarbons containing hydrogen and carbon. During combustion, the carbon is oxidized into carbon dioxide, and the hydrogen is oxidized into water.
Fire,
Fire!
fire. All you need is a little O2, a hydrocarbon, any kind will do. Strike a match, ignite the reaction, and then we'll have some real hot action.
I'm the big O. I'll give you a boost to share some electrons. But I get reduced. Together we can be a sensation. Let's make that heat-releasing kind of oxidation. Go, 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 covalent bonding. Go, 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 covalent bond.
Carbon transforms to CO2, floats up to the sky of blue. Hydrogen becomes H2O. That's the original fire water, don't you know?
The energy of which we're so fond.
when you really need it. What a dredge. Oh, man.
Iron, like other metals, can also be oxidized, but its electrons are not shared with oxygen. They are simply taken. These electrons give oxygen a negative charge and leave the iron positively charged. The two oppositely charged atoms then bind together in a ratio of 3:2 to form ferric oxide, or rust, which is held together not by shared electrons, but by electrical attraction. This is called an ionic bond.
I've got those rusted out junkyard blues. Since some of my electrons I did lose. You know that mean and selfish atom, he just came and then did grab him. I'm a victim of an oxygen ruse.
I've got those rusted out junkyard blues. Oxygen and ions are really bad news. Our bonding is ionic, but believe me, it's platonic. 'Twas an offer I just couldn't refuse.
I've got those rusted out junkyard blues, and all I've got are worthless IOUs. They told me to be positive, but look how I have to live. Now I'm paying my oxidation dues.
I've got those rusted out junkyard blues.
Oh yeah.
I've got those rusted out, busted out, sitting in a junkyard blues.
Rust in peace, baby.
The oxidation that takes place within us gives us the energy of life. It happens within every cell in our bodies, every moment of our lives. How does oxygen get from the air around us to the cells within us? It's a chain of events that begins when we breathe air into our lungs. The lungs are like a pair of bellows that suck air in and out. When they expand, a partial vacuum is created and higher pressure air from outside rushes in. When they contract, the air pressure in the lungs increases and air is blown out. The air travels through a network of ever-narrowing pipes called bronchi that branch off like an upside-down tree. At the end of the line are tiny air sacs called alveoli, which are surrounded by tiny blood vessels called capillaries. Each lung contains 300 million alveoli. With each incoming breath, oxygen molecules diffuse across the alveolus membrane and into the capillary. With each breath out, carbon dioxide molecules, the waste products of energy use, move across the membrane in the opposite direction and are blown out. In the capillary, oxygen attaches itself to red blood cells. They contain hemoglobin, a special oxygen-binding protein. As the oxygen-depleted cells pick up oxygen, they change color from blue to red. The oxygen then begins a piggyback ride from the lungs to the left side of the heart, and then out through a network of pipes called arteries to the body tissues. The red cells finally arrive at a capillary in the tissues, which marks the last station on this leg of their journey. Here, they give up their oxygen to the surrounding cells and pick up their waste load of carbon dioxide. They change color again, this time back to blue. Inside the cell, a form of combustion takes place. The oxygen forms covalent bonds with carbohydrate and fat from our diet. Heat and energy are produced, and carbon dioxide and water are released as byproducts. The red cells, now blue, start on the return leg of their journey. They travel back to the right side of the heart, and from there to the lung, where they again unload the carbon dioxide and pick up a fresh batch of oxygen to begin the cycle all over again. What happens when the body doesn't get enough oxygen? In the thin air at high altitude, the lack of oxygen can lead to serious illness, even death. It's called mountain sickness, and it mainly affects the lungs and the brain, causing them to swell. The world's tallest mountain is Mount Everest, over 9,300 meters or 29,000 feet. The air at the top has only about 1/3 as much oxygen as that at sea level. In 1953, Sir Edmund Hillary, together with his Sherpa guide Tenzing Norgay, became the first climber to reach the top of Everest.
I can remember the fact that when we were at high altitude, everything we did was very much slower. I remember that the photographs that were taken by George Lowe on the South Col, he actually filmed me emerging from the tent, putting on my crampons and putting on my warm gear. And when I saw these films, I thought they were absolutely ridiculous. Something was wrong with the camera because I was moving so slowly. This wasn't an error in the camera at all. That's the way it was. Because of the effect of altitude at 26,000 feet, I was doing things a great deal more slowly.
Some people suffer low oxygen in their blood, even without going to high altitude. Down at sea level, diseases of the heart and lung can also rob the body of the oxygen it needs. Dr. John Sutton of McMaster University looks after such patients. He has also studied climbers at high altitude.
Now, John has a condition where he has low oxygen in his blood and in some ways resembles the patient at high altitude. The fundamental problem that John has is that he has lung disease, which prevents the normal transfer of oxygen from the outside air into the bloodstream and then, of course, being pumped around to the tissues. He's breathing much more than he would have normally at sea level. You can see these are extra muscles being used for breathing. And also you'll notice that he's plethoric. He's got a reddish coloration here because he's increased the amount of hemoglobin and the number of red cells to compensate for the low oxygen. And if in spite of that the oxygen remains low, sometimes you have to, as in John's case here, administer extra oxygen to make up for what can't be compensated for by the body.
This man has emphysema. The alveoli in a normal lung act as springs, allowing the lung to expand and contract. In emphysema, many alveoli are destroyed, and the lung loses its elastic property. Like most patients with emphysema, this man's disease was caused by smoking. This is a nursery for premature babies. These babies are often short of oxygen because their lungs are still immature and not yet able to fully expand. They require supplementary oxygen, but it must be carefully monitored and controlled. At this vulnerable stage in their development, too much oxygen can cause blindness. Climbers who develop mountain sickness also require more oxygen. The simplest solution is to climb down to heavier air, but that's not always possible. The victim may be too weak or the conditions too dangerous. Dr. Igor Gamo, the man in the hat, has invented a way to get heavier air to the climber. He puts him into a specially designed bag and pumps it full of air. The pressure inside the bag can be raised to twice the pressure outside.
How do you feel inside, Pat?
This often provides enough oxygen to revive a sick climber.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, good. Okay, and just take a deep breath and hold it on safety.
As part of their training, these future pilots are going to high altitude in a vacuum chamber. Inside this modern-day Magdeburg sphere, they will experience firsthand the effects of low oxygen. They breathe pure oxygen as the climb begins. The air in this glove will expand as the air in the chamber gets thinner. The first 10,000 feet are climbed in an instant when a valve is opened and air is sucked into an adjoining vacuum.
All right. Okay, gentlemen, welcome to 10,000 feet.
The thinner air cannot contain as much moisture, and the excess produces a brief fog. They gradually climb up to 30,000 feet, about the height at which most jetliners fly, and 1,000 feet above Everest.
3, 2, 1.
They disconnect their oxygen masks.
Put the metal ferrule on and start the exercise. Remember, gentlemen, this is not a speed test. It is simply something to...
The first signs of low oxygen are felt in the brain. They're given a simple mental test. which becomes harder and harder.
Okay. Hook up now.
Before any serious problems arise, they reconnect their masks.
Basically, I felt uncoordinated with my writing, with my symbols.
Well, I felt a little lightheaded, dizzy, you know, as if you were going to pass out.
Oxygen tanks were considered essential equipment when Hillary and Tenzing set out for the summit of Everest in 1953.
Of course, we have to also remember that in those days, we had a psychological barrier that we didn't really know, in fact, whether it was possible to get to the top of Everest, even using oxygen. And certainly the thought of going to the top without oxygen never really entered our mind.
But 7 years earlier, in this vacuum chamber, a dramatic experiment showed that it was theoretically possible to climb Everest without oxygen. 4 U.S. Navy sailors spent 35 days inside the chamber as the air pressure was gradually lowered to the equivalent of the summit of Everest. The ascent was slow enough to allow their bodies time to adapt to the low oxygen. They were studied by a team of scientists led by Dr. Charles Houston. The scientists had to wear oxygen masks when they periodically entered the chamber. To demonstrate the effects of acclimatization, this visitor has his oxygen mask removed. Within a few minutes, he loses consciousness. In contrast, this acclimatized subject is able to perform normally at the same altitude. Notice the observer wearing an oxygen mask.
The explanation for this aberration is a talent we have called adaptation.
This revelation's not imagination. It even works at high elevation when you get the sensation of a large separation between you and your starting location.
So even deprivation of your oxygenation, if done real slow, means acclimatization. Our recommendation: avoid hospitalization by taking your time during escalation.
Don't go up too fast
if you want to last.
In 1978, Everest was finally climbed without oxygen by Reinhold Messner and Peter Hebler. They fulfilled the prediction made over 30 years before that with acclimatization alone, man could survive breathing the thinnest air on Earth. There are many people who live their entire lives at high altitude. Perhaps the best known are the Sherpas of Nepal, who live within sight of Mount Everest. Over the centuries, their bodies have adapted to the thin air they live and work in. High altitude is known to decrease fertility, yet the Sherpas are able to reproduce normally. Because of their adaptation, Sherpas are great mountain climbers and often carry the heaviest loads on climbing expeditions.
Over the years, all the people who have climbed Mount Everest, there have been 2 Sherpas, both of whom have reached the summit of Mount Everest 5 times each without oxygen, which I think is an indication that the Sherpas perhaps have certain advantages over we ordinary mortals at low level.
The Sherpas don't live alone. Their beast of burden, the yak, is also adapted to do heavy work at high altitude. It has developed a special kind of hemoglobin that allows it to carry more oxygen in its blood. In the Andes Mountains of South America, the llama is the counterpart to the yak. But the high-altitude champion is a bird.
If you're climbing up Mount Everest, puffing away, you pause for a moment, you look up, and there's a flock of bar-headed geese flying, say, 3,000 feet above you. So they must know something that we don't.
Other animals live in a low oxygen environment, even at normal altitude. Turtles spend winters dug under the mud at the bottom of lakes and streams. The oxygen level in their blood drops drastically, but they can slow down their metabolism enough to survive. Polar bears also slow down in winter. They too are able to exist for months at a time with a much reduced oxygen level. They're also good divers and can hold their breath longer and drop their blood oxygen lower than we can. The best divers of all are seals. They make use of a response called the dive reflex, which conserves oxygen. When their body senses they are diving, their heart rate slows down and blood is diverted away from non-essential organs to the heart and brain. It's a neat trick that we too are born with, but gradually lose. Life means adaptation, but all animals, including us, can only adapt so far. We will always depend on oxygen.
What life's about, without a doubt, is breathing in and breathing out. We breathe a substance we cannot see. We don't have to pay for it, it's totally free. Oxygen, we need oxygen. Oxygen, we breathe oxygen. It's the gas for me.
Turns a spark into a flame. Combustion is the name of its game. Inside us it burns calories. Without that gas we'd simply freeze. Climbing up through the mountain snow. The air gets thinner, the higher you go. Your heart beats faster, your brain turns to stew. Your lungs start screaming, give me more O2.
Oxygen, we need oxygen.
What a blast.
Oxygen, we breathe oxygen.
Fan my flame.
It's not like the food that's on a shelf. We can't make a store inside ourselves. We need it each moment to blow our licks. Oh, oxygen, it's the hippest of kicks.
Oxygen, we need oxygen.
OXYGEN.
Oxygen, we breathe oxygen. What a gas! Oxygen, we breathe oxygen.
Hey, hey.